Hello, guys. There is Josh right there. Thank you to Charlotte and her mom for letting me know that you could not hear me at all. That would have been a very boring video to just watch me read a book without hearing me read it. So, chapter 10, music. Benjamin still hadn't told anybody he wasn't Mark Miller. His grades had never been better. Mark Miller is a lot smarter than Benjamin Nushmut, he thought. When they chose up teams for kickball, he was always the first one picked. Mark Miller is a better kicker than Benjamin Nushmut, he realized. The girls in his class liked him too. Mark Miller is better looking than Benjamin Nushmut, he decided. But unfortunately, he knew he had to tell Mrs. Jules his real name. He sighed, then slowly raised his hand. Mrs. Jules gave him a tambourine. He had been so busy thinking about his problem, he hadn't noticed that Mrs. Jules was passing out musical instruments. She had just asked, who would like the tambourine? So when he raised his hand, she gave it to him. Who would like the triangle? Asked Mrs. Jules. Joe raised his hand and Mrs. Jules gave it to him. Why is it called a triangle? Asked Joe. I don't know, said Mrs. Jules. Maybe because it's shaped like a triangle, suggested John. No, that can't be it, said Mrs. Jules. Then the tambourine would have to be called a circle. Maybe it was invented by a person named Joe Triangle, said Rondi. That's probably it, said Mrs. Jules. She held up the next instrument. It was a glockenspiel. Who would like the glockenspiel? She asked. Sherry raised her hand. Nobody asked why it was called the glockenspiel. It was obvious. Mrs. Jules gave the bells to Stephen. Why are these called bells? He asked. Nobody knew. Joy got the bongo drums, Todd got the bass drum, Jenny snared the snare drum, and Leslie got the kettle drum. When they banged on them, it hurt everybody else's eardrums. Mrs. Jules gave one cymbal to Calvin and the other one to BB. DJ got the gong, the three Erics got kazoos. Mrs. Jules shouted, Uno, dos, tres, cuatro. The children all played their instruments. They shook, rattled, rocked, and rolled. Joy bonged her bongos. DJ gonged his gong. Sherry glockened her glockenspiel. Stephen jingled his bells. Calvin and BB slapped their cymbals together, and Joe's triangle went ting. But something didn't sound right. What's wrong, Mark? Mrs. Jules shouted over the music. Why aren't you playing the tambourine? My name's not Mark, said Benjamin. It's Benjamin Nushmut. I'm sorry for not telling you before. What? Asked Mrs. Jules. I can't hear you. My name isn't Mark, he said. It's Benjamin. Louder, said Mrs. Jules. So everybody played louder. Todd bashed his bass drum. Leslie cooked on her kettle drum. Calvin and BB crashed their cymbals together, and Joe's triangle went ting. My name is Benjamin, shouted Benjamin. Mrs. Jules put her hand to her ear. Louder! So everybody played louder yet again. DJ kabonged his gong. Joy jonged her bongos. Paul spackled his castanets. Jenny spaghettied her snare drum. Calvin and BB whammered their cymbals, and Joe's triangle still went ting. My name's Benjamin Nushmut, hollered Benjamin Nushmut. Louder! Yelled Mrs. Jules. So everybody kept playing louder. The three Erics screamed into their kazoos. Calvin and BB ran to the opposite sides of the room with their cymbals and then charged towards each other. Suddenly the door flew open and a man entered. Benjamin had never seen him before. The whole class became very quiet. It was Mr. Kidswater, the principal. Calvin and BB screeched to a halt just in time. Their cymbals were less than an inch apart. Is something the matter, Mr. Kidswater? Asked Mrs. Jules. Several teachers have complained about your music, said Mr. Kidswater. Their students are having trouble hearing. I understand, said Mrs. Jules. Good, said Mr. Kidswater. He walked out of the room. Okay, you heard Mr. Kidswater, said Mrs. Jules. We will have to play louder so everybody can hear. Uno, dos, tres, cuatro. They shook, rattled, rocked, and rolled. Benjamin frampled his tambourine. Excellent, Mark, shouted Mrs. Jules. He smiled. He had never played so well before. Mark Miller is a better musician than Benjamin Nushmut, he thought. And that's it, guys. Hopefully you can hear me this time. Have a good afternoon.